today we're actually going to be breaking down the ins and outs of how a vendor take-back mortgage really is drafted up, the process of what goes into some of those clauses or terms, and how it looks like when it actually closes.
One thing to be cautious of and careful is there is some fairly significant case law from the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court where private lenders have to be cautious of. I think in both scenarios, the one thing, if you are giving the loan, that you want to really strongly consider is, well, are you in first position or not? Because that obviously is significant to your ability to potentially collect if there's a problem, right, on enforcement. And then the other thing to consider would be
What's going on YouTube? It's Lynn Matheson here. Welcome to another episode on the Canadian Real Estate Channel. We are joined by Ryan. He is back to break down the lawyer's take on vendor take-back mortgages, part 2. So Ryan, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me for part 2 and with the group again, as always. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, guys, thanks for tuning in. If you're not already subscribed to the Canadian Real Estate Channel, I really would appreciate it a lot if you would subscribe, because it definitely helps us pump out more content in Canadian real estate investing and ultimately connect with more of our subscribers, more people like you who are viewing this video right now. So if you're viewing this and you're not subscribed, it would really help us out if you just click that subscribe button, and then you can see more of our videos. And also make sure you smash that like button, as well as throw us some love in the comment section below and let us know if there's anything more that you'd like to know about vendor take-back mortgages. So Ryan from Carson Law, welcome back to the channel. Let's break this down. So just to surmise, our last video, we actually kind of talked about an example of what's actually happening live right now with a vendor take-back closing and a potential strategy of a seller kind of going into second position on some of that loan. We also talked about the fact that the seller could go into first position, as well as breaking down some of the pros and cons from both the buyer and the seller's side. So today we're actually going to be breaking down the ins and outs of how a vendor take-back mortgage really is drafted up, the process of what goes into some of those clauses or terms, and how it looks like when it actually closes. So we're going to be breaking down kind of the nitty-gritty background details of the vendor take-back mortgage so that you guys can fully understand what it actually is and what it looks like. So Ryan, again, welcome back to the channel. Let's dive right back into this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe it might be helpful to just sort of say, like, what are the terms of the VTB that, you know, are probably never going to change, right? Or at least they could be different terms, but they're always going to be in there, right? So there's always going to be an amount, right? There's always going to be some principal amount loaned, of course, right? There's going to be an interest rate. There's going to be a payment frequency, and there's going to be like a term. So how long is it for? And then, like I would say, those are essentially the bread and butter terms that you're always going to need to have, or will always be included in the VTB financing, right? So it could be the loan amount is $100,000, the interest rate's 10%, it's for a 1-year term, and we're paying monthly on the first of the month. So there's a simple example of what like those high level, consistent, all the time terms are going to be. I would probably add to that you would probably very rarely see a VTB that would have an amortization period, because that would then indicate that it's principal and interest payments, which is not typically the case with VTBs, as also with private mortgages. It's interest only, right? So you're almost always going to make sure that it references a term of interest only. So that's a term to make sure you've got. So it's very clear that the amount of that payment is only interest. It's not going to knock down the loan amount. And then you'd want to make sure you would add additional terms in to say, like, is this an open or closed mortgage? Is there a penalty fee or a fee for paying it back early before the term? If so, what is that fee? And then typically you might also have like a table or a chart or list of common events or possible common events that might occur, like NSF checks, requests for discharge, payment statements, and so forth. Like the lawyer will have like probably a scripted list for you, and then you would list in there like these are the costs for those different items being triggered if they happened, right? Obviously, the more you have in there, hopefully the more you're covered, for something. Plus, it's better disclosure essentially to the borrower, right? If there was ever a challenge by the borrower that it seems unreasonable, unfair, or not previously agreed to. So, I mean, those would definitely be terms. I think one thing to be cautious of and careful is there is some fairly significant case law from the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court where private lenders have to be cautious of what fees they charge. You can't charge particular types of fees that would just artificially inflate payouts, right? So, and a lawyer would go into much more greater detail with you of like how that kind of all works, but that's just one thing to be careful about when you're putting the terms together, because you need to make sure the lawyer can tell you that this fee that you're relying on to be paid back or be part of the expectation of your investment is actually something you can legally collect, right? Because otherwise, if push came to shove and it actually went to an arbitration or to a court hearing because the borrower felt like this violated the case law around fees and interest rates, well, you don't want to lose on that, because that's how you were banking your investment here, right? Because the VTB is an investment for you as the person providing it, right? So I think discussing in greater detail fees, custom fees, etc., because usually the more and more creative they get, they're likely getting closer to being void by the case law, right? But again, those are good one-on-one conversations to have with the lawyer, kind of when you're putting the term sheet together of the VTB. But definitely you've got those 4 or 5 terms that'll always be a part of the VTB because they're fundamental and crucial to it. And then it's just a question of kind of determining those other more unique or creative one-off terms and fees and so forth to make sure they could be charged legally under the law, and number 2, that they're properly worded so that it's covering, if you're the lender, your expectations for return on your investment, right?
Absolutely. Now that's such a great breakdown of the kind of like ins and outs of that contract before we even get to that stage. From the buyer or seller perspective, all you need in the agreement of purchase and sale is actually just the clause that states some of those key things that you mentioned, and then that's all ironed out in the actual vendor take back mortgage letter. So just to start, when you're negotiating one of these, or as the seller or as the buyer, if it's something that you want to include in that actual purchase and sale agreement, you're going to want to have some of those things ironed out. So is this interest only payment? What is the actual percentage, or what is the actual amount that is being held back by the seller? How much are they loaning you? And then what the percentage that you're paying on that loan, so the actual interest payments, and from there it can be kind of further digested by the lawyer. So the next conversation is, who's actually drafting that up? So is that going to be the seller's lawyer that's drafting that? Is that the buyer's lawyer that's drafting that? And who's paying for that to be drafted up as well? So those are all things to identify early on in that. And then we can get into some of the once that is drafted, then it is reviewed by both parties and further agreed to. So, but that initial phase, if you're just trying to enter into a vendor take back agreement, is to iron out those few key details on the purchase and sale agreement, and then a further document is drafted. So that is kind of how it looks from a buyer or seller perspective. Now, the lawyers will do the back end work. So exactly what you just stated, Ryan, about kind of having that template, that format, the breakdown of kind of the nitty gritty details on the back end of, is there going to be a fee if, for example, there's a missed payment, if that check bounces, or if something doesn't go through? It's actually important that the lawyer has all of those points covered for you from that perspective of that mortgage commitment, as both the buyer and as the seller who's holding that mortgage back, to really understand what the actual breakdown of the terms of the agreement are.
Yeah, and I mean, my thoughts on that, just briefly, is, I mean, if I'm the lender, I want my lawyer to probably draft like the terms and the documents, just because they're my lawyer. That's their job, to make sure like it's written the way we want it, and to make sure that the protection is in place that we've discussed, right? I know some people, because they're trying to keep maybe the cost down and that sort of thing, or maybe their lawyer's a bit lazy, that, you know, they put it over to the buyer to do it, right? But I mean, one of your terms you're going to negotiate for the VTB is, well, any of your lawyer's costs are coming out of the loan amount, you know.
Right.
So if you're giving $100,000, but your lawyer's fees, you know, come to an account of 3,000, well, then guess what? You're only advancing 97 from the 100 to the borrower, to the buyer. And so at the end of the day, they're still paying you back on $100,000, but you're not going to be out any costs. So really, you shouldn't be worried about saving costs, because it's just like, you know, you're not going to have any costs, right? The only thing is how much is left over on the net advance from the VTB to the borrower, which is the buyer, in this example, right? So yeah, I mean, that's my 2 cents on, you know, if I'm the VTB, if I'm the lender, how I want my lawyer to put it together, because that's who I'm relying upon to make sure I have the terms and security that I want. I want to make sure it's like his or hers, like they've taken the responsibility of drafting it, because at the end of the day, that's also your recourse if there's an error, right, with your lawyer. Not, you know, you don't have a relationship with the borrower's lawyer, so if they didn't draft something, well, you know, it's not as your recourse might not be as good, because it's not your lawyer, right? I mean, yes, your lawyer might not have reviewed it properly. That's possible. I just think, hey, if you're going to act for a lender, do the lender documents. So that would be my 2 cents about if you're going to give a VTB, have your lawyer still kind of prepare it all, because whatever their cost is it's not going to end up being a cost to you, really, because it's coming off the loan amount itself.
Absolutely. That's great. Any other kind of things that you've seen in drafting vendor take-back mortgages, representing the lender, or even in purchasing vendor take-back mortgages, just anything that you've seen in the documents or kind of scenarios that you've run into, that you could provide some guidance to people who are interested in pursuing something like this?
Yeah, I think, you know, if you're pursuing, like, looking at doing this, whether it's kind of by necessity because it needs to solve a problem, or it's actually like part of your financing strategy that you're utilizing. I think in both scenarios, the one thing, if you are giving the loan, that you want to really strongly consider is well, are you in first position or not? Because that obviously is significant to your ability to potentially collect if there's a problem, right, on enforcement. And then the other thing to consider would be, okay, if I'm not, whether I'm in first or second or third position or what have you, what also is like the loan to value of this property, right? So, the higher the loan to value, meaning, if you're lending an amount that makes it so that there's less immediate equity in the property if it got sold the next day, the higher the loan to value, the more risky your loan is as well, right? So that's where you kind of don't want to think in terms of like everything goes well, I get paid money. You always want to think worst case scenario. And so worst case scenario, if I give out this money and I know it's got a loan to value of like 95%, that's much riskier than if I'm giving the same amount out on the same property at 65% or 70%, right? And appraisals are a funny thing. Like, they're good. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, you could get an appraised value to help you determine that. You could use the sale price, because we are doing a sale here when we're talking about a VTB. So you already know a price that the market will pay at that particular time. But look at the example we just went through, or we're going through in today's market, which is there's been a plateau or a cooling, right? Maybe even a bit of a dip in certain areas on certain properties. So you got to think, okay, even if I sold it in this sale transaction for $1 million, I did that at a pretty average or hot market. So let's scrape off like 20%, in a worst case scenario. Maybe I can only sell it for 800,000. Do your loan to value maybe off of that kind of example, right? So you get a bit of a range, right? Like, the point of this is, as the lender, you want to make sure that you're going to get your money from the actual enforcement proceeding, if you had to go through notice of sale or power of sale, right?
Absolutely.
So that's the main thing, and it's better to work off, I think, a very conservative or maybe depreciated loan to value than taking the the exact sale price of the deal you just did, or an appraisal that's in a hotter market, right? I think you want to, if you're doing that, that's fine. I think you just want to maybe claw it back a little bit to be like, well, what if it was like 20% lower? Like, that's pretty significant drop, but like, what would happen if it was 20% lower? Could I still comfortably get all my stuff back? Am I going to get my money and my fees that I need to get back? And so that is an analysis that I think you need to do when you come to the conclusion that you want to give the vendor take back financing. On the flip side, if you're the borrower, like the buyer, I think the most crucial part is just really making sure all like the disclosed extra fees. Like, really make sure you feel like you've got that down pat, because I think one of the more common ones that we always see come up that people are disputing is the penalty. Like, what is the penalty? Is it a 3-month interest rate payment? Is there, what are the terms of that, right? Or make, if you, so that would be number one. If you were the buyer, make sure you know that kind of those fees, and then maybe you should be making sure as well, just like I said earlier, the lender should make sure fees they want to be charged can be charged, like by law. You would want to make sure the same on your end with your lawyer as the borrower, that these are appropriate to be able to be charged, right, under the case law that the Ontario Appeals Courts put down. I guess the other thing as a buyer on the buyer borrower side that I was thinking about is you probably want to make sure that you know what your exit strategy is and how that relates to the term, right? So if you know that your strategy is you're using this VTB sort of as your BDOC, your balance due on closing, and you want to be able to, as quickly as possible, institutionally, refinance it out, like on a BRRRR, right? Like a BRRRR would be a common spot where, hey, you could use the VTB if it's available. That, with whatever other financing you have, allows you to put like literally nothing down. So now you can keep maybe more of it for the renovation work, the BRRRR work, or maybe you use the VTB as the BRRRR work, right? Bottom line is you've got little of your own money and your investors out. You're using it this way instead. But you want to make sure, if the term isn't short on a closed VTB mortgage, if it was like a full year, but you're going to be done in like 6 months, you want to make sure it's open, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that's another key thing, depending on the type of deal. But I think you could really start to see VTBs, if you weren't already using it as a real estate investor, you might see it start to be more heavily used, again, if the equity is available.
Well, if you think of the exact scenario that you gave with like a BRRRR investment strategy, you're going to buy a distressed property. Maybe it's harder to finance, so you might have to go private anyways. So who's the best private lender to go to? Well, the seller of the property that already knows the property, and you can get fantastic terms. Maybe you don't have to put as much down, so you can get 80%, 90% loan to value on that. You can save a lot of upfront costs that you can put into the renovation and add that value back into the property. It's win-win for both scenarios because you've just added value to the property that the person's loaning on. So it's become safer and safer to loan on that property. And then it's a win for you because you don't have as much capital to outlay. And then you get to add the value, put tenants in there, secure and stabilize that asset, and then refinance it out. And if you have an open term, you have no prepayment penalty on that private loan. So you're able to, defer having to pay that seller out by X amount of time. And that time they're earning the interest from that loan and able to defer those gains as well. So it's certainly a win-win there from all parties, as long as they have the equity built in. So I definitely see this as a strategy that can be utilized very effectively by investors, buyers, as well as sellers. And at the end of the day, it's just understanding what each party needs and wants out of the transaction, and kind of talking it through and just making sure that everyone has the terms and conditions that they want, and that you have your lawyer who's paid to be paranoid and runs through all of the doomsday scenarios for you, and ultimately is the one to draft up the agreement and make sure that your interests are covered.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're bang on.
Awesome. Well, Ryan, is there anything else you have to add here to Vendor Take Back Mortgages, or what's the best place for people to find you?
I don't think anything more to add, just high level. If anybody needs any help, you find us at carsonlaw.ca or at our social media on Facebook or Instagram. Follow us, LinkedIn, and we're happy to help anybody, on their particular scenarios, with a consultation. So looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Well, Ryan, thanks again for joining us on the Canadian Real Estate channel here. And for those of you listening and watching this video, make sure that if you're not already, that you subscribe to the channel. We really appreciate it. It helps us out. It helps us bring you more value, more content. Smash that like button and throw some love in the comment section below. And we'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.